James pulled into his driveway, exhausted from a long shift at work. The sun hung heavy in the sky, baking the pavement, and the only thing on his mind was getting inside, kicking off his shoes, and pouring himself a cold glass of lemonade. But as he stepped out of his car, something strange caught his eye, a long orange extension cord stretching from the side of his house. His forehead creased as he followed the cord with his eyes, tracing its path as it slithered across his lawn and into his neighbor's yard. His stomach tightened. That was his outlet. He knew it without a doubt. And the cord wasn't just lying there by accident. It was plugged in, running straight into Karen's house. James exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe she was testing something and forgot to unplug it. But deep down, he already knew better. He had lived next to Karen for almost 2 years now, and she had never given him a reason to believe she respected his space. She was the type of neighbor who always watched from behind her blinds, the type who called the HOA over minor infractions but conveniently ignored the rules when they applied to her. He took a deep breath and walked toward her front door, knocking firmly. He waited. No answer. He knocked again, this time louder. Finally, he heard movement inside. The door swung open, revealing Karen, standing in her doorway with an annoyed expression as if he were the one intruding on her peace. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with impatience. James forced a tight smile. "Yeah, you can explain why your extension cord is plugged into my house." Karen blinked, then glanced over his shoulder at the cord as if she had only just noticed it. Then, without missing a beat, she shrugged. "Oh, that? I had a little outage, and I figured you wouldn't mind sharing for a bit." James narrowed his eyes. "Without asking?" Karen let out a light scoff and crossed her arms. "It's just a little electricity, James. It's not like I'm stealing your car." James felt his jaw tighten. "Electricity isn't free, and it's mine. You can't just take it." Karen rolled her eyes, clearly unbothered. "Look, it was just for a little while. I didn't think you'd even notice." James glanced back at the cord and then back at her. "You've got a whole AC unit running on this thing. How long has it been plugged in?" She shifted her weight, suddenly looking defensive. "I don't know. A day, be two?" James' patience was running out. "2 days? Karen, you've been running your house on my power for 2 days without saying a word?" "Oh, calm down," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "You act like I drained your bank account or something. It's just electricity." James took a deep breath, trying to keep himself from losing his temper. "That's not the point. The point is, you didn't ask. You just helped yourself to something that isn't yours." Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Fine, I'll unplug it. Are you happy now?" James shook his head, disbelief washing over him. "That's not even the issue anymore. Do you even get why this is a problem?" She stared at him, unimpressed. "It's a tiny bit of electricity. Are you really going to make a big deal out of this?" James clenched his fists. This isn't about electricity. It was about respect, or in Karen's case, the complete lack of it. But before he could respond, Karen did something that made his blood boil. She smirked, a smug, condescending smirk that told him she thought she had won. And then, before he could say another word, she turned around and slammed the door in his face. James stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door in disbelief. His heart pounded with frustration. His fists clenched at his sides. He had dealt with difficult people before, but Karen's sheer audacity was something else. She had stolen his electricity, shrugged it off like it was nothing, and then had the nerve to slam the door in his face. Taking a deep breath, James turned on his heel and marched back toward the extension cord. If she wasn't going to do the right thing, then he would handle it himself. He reached down, grabbed the plug, and yanked it out of the socket. Immediately, the humming of her air conditioning unit next door sputtered and died. A few seconds later, the door swung open again. What the hell are you doing?" Karen screeched, storming onto her porch. James turned to face her, his expression calm but firm. "Taking back what's mine." Karen let out an exaggerated laugh, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Wow, you're really making a big deal out of this, huh?" "It is a big deal," James shot back. "You stole from me, Karen. That's not okay." She scoffed, throwing her hands in the air. "Oh, come on. It's not like I broke into your house and robbed you. It's just a little electricity. You wouldn't have even noticed if you hadn't been so nosy. James felt a sharp spike of anger at that. Nosy? He was nosy for noticing that his own electricity was being stolen. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to keep himself steady. Let me ask you something. If I came over to your house and started siphoning your water without asking, would that be okay? Karen rolled her eyes. That's completely different. No, it's not, James countered. You took something that wasn't yours without permission. That's theft. Doesn't matter if it's water, money, or electricity, it's still stealing. Karen crossed her arms tightly, her face hardening. Oh, please. The way you're acting, you'd think I committed some huge crime. You really expect me to believe you can't afford to spare a little electricity? James let out a humorless laugh. My finances aren't the point. The point is, you don't get to decide what's okay to take from other people. She opened her mouth as if she had a retort ready, but before she could speak, another voice cut through the air. Karen, what's going on? James turned to see another neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, standing on her porch across the street. She was an older woman, kind but sharp, and she had clearly been watching the exchange unfold. Karen turned toward her, folding her arms defensively. Nothing, just dealing with some ridiculous overreaction. Mrs. Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Because it looks like James caught you stealing his power. Karen's expression flickered for just a second, just long enough for James to catch it, before she scoffed again. It's not stealing. My power went out and I just borrowed some electricity. It's not a big deal. Mrs. Rodriguez shook her head. It is a big deal. You don't take things without asking. If you needed help, you should have just knocked on his door and asked. James crossed his arms. That's all it would have taken, Karen. A simple ask. Karen let out another exaggerated sigh, clearly realizing she wasn't going to win this argument. Fine, she muttered. I should have asked. Whatever. James shook his head, knowing she didn't really mean it. But before he could say anything else, Karen did something that made his blood run cold. She pulled out her phone. Since you want to act like I'm the bad guy here, she said with a smirk, maybe I should call the cops and tell them you're threatening me. James stared at her, his stomach twisting into a knot. He had seen this kind of situation before. He knew exactly what she was trying to do. And judging by the way Mrs. Rodriguez's face darkened, she did too. James felt his whole body tense as Karen held up her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. He had seen enough stories on the news to know where this was going. Karen wasn't just trying to deflect blame. She was trying to paint herself as the victim. Are you serious right now? He asked, his voice low and controlled. Karen smirked. Oh, I don't know, James. You are standing on my property, yelling at me. She tilted her head in mock concern. Who's to say I don't feel threatened? James exhaled slowly, willing himself to stay calm. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't threatening her. But that didn't matter, because people like Karen knew exactly how to twist the truth to get their way. Mrs. Rodriguez stepped off her porch, marching toward them with purpose. Karen, you'd better think real hard before making that call, she warned. Karen scoffed, but there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. I don't see how this is any of your business. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed her arms. Oh, it's my business when I see a grown woman trying to weaponize the police against her neighbor because she got caught stealing. James glanced at her, gratitude swelling in his chest. He wasn't alone in this. But Karen, undeterred, lifted her chin and tapped her phone screen. Yeah, I'd like to report a trespasser, she said into the phone, her voice dripping with faux distress. James closed his eyes for half a second, steadying himself. He had done nothing wrong, but that didn't mean he wasn't in danger. Karen continued her performance. He's refusing to leave my property, and he's being really aggressive. I don't feel safe. She shot James a triumphant look. Mrs. Rodriguez let out an incredulous laugh. Oh, you don't feel safe after stealing from him and threatening to lie to the cops? Unbelievable. James forced himself to stay silent, to not give Karen anything she could twist. His mind was already racing through the possibilities. Best case, the cops showed up, saw through her nonsense, and told her to knock it off. Worst case, well, he didn't even want to think about that. Uh-huh, Karen continued, nodding into the phone. Black male, mid-30s, wearing a blue shirt and jeans. Tall, kind of aggressive. James clenched his jaw. He hated how casual she was about it, how effortlessly she tossed those words around, words that could change the entire outcome of this situation. Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't having it. You do not want to go down this road, Karen. Karen ignored her, turning slightly away as if to emphasize her supposed fear. Yes, please hurry. And then she ended the call with a satisfied sigh. James took another deep breath. He had two options. He could stay and risk the situation escalating further, or he could walk away and hope the police weren't the type to assume he was guilty before hearing the full story. Mrs. Rodriguez seemed to read his mind. You're not going anywhere, she said firmly. We'll wait for them together. I'm not letting you stand out here alone when they show up. James nodded, appreciation flickering through him. Karen, meanwhile, looked far too pleased with herself. I guess we'll see who's in the wrong when they get here. She leaned against her porch railing, watching them like she had already won. James didn't say anything. He just crossed his arms and waited, heart pounding as he listened for the sound of sirens in the distance. The air felt thick with tension as James stood in Karen's yard, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His heart pounded steadily, but he forced himself to keep his expression neutral. Karen had called the cops on him, and now all he could do was wait. Mrs. Rodriguez stood beside him, her arms crossed as well, her gaze locked onto Karen with open disdain. Karen, on the other hand, was the picture of smug satisfaction. She leaned casually against her porch railing, her phone still in her hand, her lips curled in a self-satisfied smirk. James had seen this before. This game Karen was playing. She had been caught doing something wrong, but instead of admitting it, she was flipping the script. Now she was the victim, and he was the threat. He took a slow breath in, trying to push down the frustration bubbling in his chest. A few minutes passed, but they felt like hours. And then the wail of a siren cut through the quiet suburban air. Karen straightened up, adjusting her shirt as if preparing for a performance. Mrs. Rodriguez muttered something under her breath, shaking her head. James remained still, hands at his sides, mind racing through every possible scenario of how this could go. A black and white patrol car rolled up to the curb, and two officers stepped out. One was an older white man with a hard, unreadable face, while the other was younger, black, and looked cautious as his eyes darted between James and Karen. Karen immediately sprang into action, rushing toward the officers with exaggerated distress. "Oh, thank God you're here," she said, clutching her chest as if she had just survived some kind of traumatic ordeal. James watched in silence, knowing better than to interrupt. Karen pointed a dramatic finger at him. "He was on my property, yelling at me. He wouldn't leave even when I asked him to. I was so scared. He got really aggressive." The older officer turned his gaze toward James. "Sir, is that true?" James kept his voice calm and steady. "No, it's not. I came over to talk to her because she had an extension cord plugged into my house, stealing my electricity." The younger officer's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Stealing your electricity?" "Yes," James said firmly. "I caught her running an extension cord from my outlet to her house. When I confronted her, she got defensive, slammed the door in my face, and then called you when I unplugged it." The older officer turned to Karen, his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, is that true?" Karen's face twisted into a look of false indignation. "I borrowed some power because my electricity was acting up. It's not like I meant any harm, and I only called you because he got aggressive and made me feel unsafe." Mrs. Rodriguez let out a loud, humorless laugh, stepping forward. "Oh, come on, Karen. You were perfectly fine until he caught you. And then when I told you to think twice about calling the cops, you did it anyway, just to play victim." Both officers turned to Mrs. Rodriguez. The younger one spoke first. "Ma'am, did you witness the interaction?" "Every second of it," she replied. "And I can tell you right now, James never threatened her, never raised his voice, never got aggressive. Karen got mad because she got caught stealing and tried to turn it around on him." The younger officer nodded, looking back at Karen, his eyes narrowing slightly. The older officer glanced at James. "Did you step onto her property?" "Yes," James admitted, keeping his tone steady. "But only to knock on her door and ask about my electricity being used. I never refused to leave. She slammed the door in my face before I even got the chance." The officers exchanged a look. The older one sighed and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, if what they're saying is true, Then this isn't a trespassing issue, it's a theft issue. Karen's eyes widened. Theft? You're kidding, right? It was just some electricity. It's not like I stole his car. The younger officer's lips pressed into a firm line. Actually, ma'am, unauthorized use of someone else's utilities is considered theft, and calling 911 under false pretenses, that's not a good look either. Karen's mouth opened and closed, her confidence faltering. She looked between the two officers, then at James, then at Mrs. Rodriguez, realizing she had lost control of the situation. Look, I didn't think it was that big of a deal, she muttered, her smugness completely gone now. The older officer pulled out a small notepad. Ma'am, I'm going to need your information. Karen's face went pale. Wait, are you saying I could get in trouble for this? That depends, the younger officer said. If Mr. Daniels here, he nodded toward James, wants to press charges for utility theft, he has every right to do so. All eyes turned to James. Karen looked at him, her expression a mix of anger and panic. Mrs. Rodriguez gave him a knowing nod, as if to say, whatever you decide, I've got your back. James took a deep breath, considering his options. He had every reason to press charges. Karen had stolen from him, lied about it, and then tried to use the police to intimidate him. But a part of him also knew how these things could escalate. Finally, he exhaled. I just want her to understand that this can't happen again, he said. I'm not going to press charges as long as she never pulls something like this again. Karen exhaled in relief but said nothing. The older officer nodded. That's your choice, sir. But ma'am, consider this your warning. Next time you will face consequences. Karen looked humiliated. Fine, she muttered. The officers turned back to James. We'll make a report, the younger one said. But it looks like we're done here. As they walked back to their car, Karen shot James one last glare before storming inside and slamming the door behind her. Mrs. Rodriguez patted James on the shoulder. You handled that better than I would have. James let out a small chuckle, but inside he was still processing everything. He had won this battle. But something told him this wasn't over. James stood on his porch later that evening, the last rays of sunlight fading into the horizon. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling down for the night should have been calming. But his mind was still replaying the events of the afternoon. Karen had tried to have him arrested over her crime. Even though he had avoided trouble this time, the whole ordeal left a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew people like Karen. She wasn't the type to take accountability. She had gotten caught, but instead of admitting she was wrong, she had doubled down, twisted the truth, and nearly put him in serious danger. Mrs. Rodriguez had been right there with him, and he was beyond grateful for that. Without her, who knew how things might have turned out? The thought made his stomach twist. A noise from next door broke his thoughts. James glanced over just in time to see Karen peeking out of her blinds, her face barely visible behind the curtain. The second she realized he had spotted her, she quickly yanked them shut. James sighed. So much for moving forward. He knew she was embarrassed, angry even, but instead of apologizing or even trying to smooth things over, she was playing the victim in her own mind. It was clear that Karen saw herself as the real one wronged. Shaking his head, James went back inside. He wasn't about to let her take up any more space in his mind. He had bigger things to focus on, like his job, his peace, and not letting Karen's nonsense disrupt either. The next morning, James left early for work. As he walked to his car, he noticed something strange. Karen's extension cord was gone. Not just unplugged, completely gone. Huh. Maybe she finally got the message. He wasn't sure if she had taken it inside out of shame or if the officers had scared her enough to clean up her act. Either way, he wasn't complaining. He got into his car, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. As he drove past Karen's house, he noticed her peeking out from behind the curtains again. James chuckled to himself. She could hide all she wanted, but she knew the truth. The workday was long, but productive. By the time James got home, he was ready to relax. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed Mrs. Rodriguez watering her flowers across the street. He stepped out of his car and waved. She smiled knowingly. Looks like she's been quiet today. James smirked. Yeah, I noticed. Think she finally learned her lesson? Mrs. Rodriguez snorted. Doubt it, but at least she's embarrassed enough to keep to herself for now. James nodded, appreciating the moment of peace. He headed inside, eager to shake off the stress of the last 24 hours. Later that night, as he was winding down, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Unknown, you made me look like a criminal. James frowned. He had a feeling he knew exactly who it was. Before he could even decide whether to reply, another message came in. Unknown. You should be grateful I didn't press charges against you for trespassing. James let out a short, humorless laugh. Unbelievable. Even now, after everything, Karen was still trying to twist the narrative. Instead of responding, he simply blocked the number. He wasn't going to waste another second on her, let her stew in her own anger. James had better things to do.